We're going to end this lesson with two application problems. So example 7 says, if X is the size of a man's shoe in Britain, then D of X equals D plus 0.05 is the size in the United States. So this is saying right up here that X equals your size in Britain and Y equals your size in the US. So it's going to be important as we go through this. So the first thing is to find the inverse of this function. So using my steps here, first thing I'm going to do is replace my f of x or my function notation with y. So this will become y equals x plus 0.5. Step 2 is interchange your x and your y. So now we have x equals y plus 0.5. And now solve for y. This one's a one-step problem. We will subtract that 0.5 over. So we get x minus 0.5 equals y. Do not stop there. We need to now replace y with our inverse notation. So we were using d of x. So the inverse of d of x equals x minus 0.5. And before we go on to part B, we need to now label what our x and our y equals. So now that I have switched my x and y's here, it means I've switched my x and y meanings up here as well. So now x is representing our size in the US and y is representing the size in Britain. So part B wants us to use the inverse function that we found right here to find the British shoe. If a shoe in the US is 8.5. Okay, so if we're using the inverse function, and now it says we have a US size of 8.5, that's representing my x. So I'm going to replace my x with 8.5. So we have 8.5 minus 0.5. So therefore, we have a size 8. Okay, so that one's very straightforward. Let's try example 8 now. Example 8 says, for many species of fish, the weight W is a function of length X by W equals K, and that should be KX, where K is the constant depending on the species. Suppose that K equals 0.002, W is in pounds, and X is in inches, so that the weight is W of X equals 0.002 X cubed. So this is probably KX cubed. All right, so before we get into our parts A through D, what does everything represent? Well, it tells me right here that my X is in inches. So X is talking about length. And my W or my Y, I don't know how I want to label that. Let's go Y/W is in pounds. Nah, let's just go Y, right? Sorry. Okay, my Y equals pounds. So first, find the inverse. So step 1 is to replace your f of x or your function notation with y. So instead of w of x, we have y equals 0.002 x cubed. Step 2 is to interchange your x and y. So now we have x equals 0.002 y cubed, and now I need to solve this for y. So before I can do anything, I need to isolate this y cubed portion. So I'm going to divide by 0.002. Now, this is going to be a MyMathLab question, and so that's why I wanted to put it into your notes. They want you to simplify x over 0.002. We typically don't want fractions or decimals in the denominator, so this is the same as 1x. So in our calculator, we're going to put in 1 over 0.002. And that gives me 500. So that becomes 500 x equals y cubed. And then lastly, the opposite of cubing y is to take the cubic root. So we will have the cubic root of 500x all under that radical equals y. Then last step is to replace your y with your inverse notation, and we are in w of x. So this will become the inverse of w of x equals the cubic root of 500x. Okay, and again, before we go to the next portion, what does my x and y equal? Okay, they are going to switch. So my x will now equal what my y is. This is now in pounds. And my y is now what my x was in inches. Okay, this sets us up exactly for part B. What does the inverse function give? Well, if my x right here is pounds, then we are solving for the length here, my inches. So, given the weight, the inverse calculates length. Part C wants us to find, or asks us, I don't know, I'm trying to say, use the function of, okay, let's start over. Part C says, use the function, one more time. Part C, use the inverse function to find the length of the fish that weighs 2 pounds. So I'm using my inverse, and if I am given 2 pounds, pounds is my x. So this represents the x right here. So we will have the inverse w of 2 equals the cubic root of 500 times my x right here is 2. So let's put that into our calculator and see what that gives. So we're going to go to math, and we are going to either arrow down or just hit 4. And we have 500 times 2 all under that radical, and we get 10. So use the inverse function to find the length. This right here is in inches. So if I have a fish that is 2 pounds, then we should have one that is 10 inches long. Now, this is another reason I wanted to put this in our notes. One, we need to make sure that we divide and simplify that. But two, in the context of the application, what are the domain and the range of the inverse function? Okay. So my domain is with my x. And if my x is representing pounds, then my X needs to be greater than 0. If I catch a fish, it's going to weigh something, even if it's the tiniest little minnow, right? It's got some kind of weight to it. If it weighs nothing, then I didn't catch anything. So my domain needs to be, my pounds must be greater than 0. I can't have 0, so it's not greater than or equal to 0, and it can't be negative. That doesn't make sense. Okay, similar. My range is my Y, and my range is in inches. So if I'm, again, talking about catching a fish, it's got to have some length to it. So my Y, which is my inverse notation here, my inverse of W of X, again, must be greater than 0.